I never imagined moving out to my late grandfather's cabin in the woods would land me in the middle of a war with an entitled neighbor, but life has a strange way of throwing chaos into the path of peace. The cabin had been in my family for decades, a place of summer fishing trips, deer hunting, and quiet evenings by the fire, and after inheriting it, I decided to fix it up and use it as my permanent home. It wasn't anything fancy, just two stories of hand-built timber surrounded by pine trees and overlooking a lake, but it was mine, and it carried memories of a childhood where the world felt simple and safe. The problem was the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, run by a small group of busybodies who had their hands in everyone's business. At the top of that list was Karen, the woman who appointed herself Queen of the Block, even though her official title was just HOA President. She was the kind of person who carried a clipboard everywhere, knew everyone's license plate number, and thought she had authority over property she didn't own. Within a week of moving in, she had welcomed me with a list of rules about how my lawn had to look, what color my shutters could be painted, and what type of mailbox I was required to install. I thanked her politely, tossed the paper in the trash, and went on living my life because the truth was the cabin wasn't even under the HOA's jurisdiction. The land was older than the community development, and the documents made it clear my property was exempt. Karen, of course, didn't see it that way, and when I refused to bow down to her ridiculous demands, she decided I was her personal project. She started with petty harassment, letters in my mailbox claiming I owed HOA dues, even though I legally didn't. Nasty notes taped to my door about how my truck was lowering neighborhood standards, and complaints to the county about noise, when all I'd been doing was hammering boards to repair the porch. Each attempt failed, but the woman was relentless, fueled by the belief that no one could possibly resist her authority. I thought that was bad enough until her teenage son, a spoiled brat who strutted around like he owned the place, decided to take things further. His name was Brandon, and he had the perfect stereotype of a suburban troublemaker, baseball cap flipped backwards, Bluetooth speaker blasting garbage music at all hours, and a smug smirk that made you want to ground him on sight. I caught him more than once snooping around my shed, and once I even chased him off when he was trying to climb onto my boat. I warned him directly, I warned Karen, and I even installed cameras around the property just in case. That turned out to be the smartest decision I could have made, because what happened next nearly pushed me over the edge. One weekend, I'd gone into town for groceries and supplies, leaving the cabin locked and secure. When I returned, I noticed the front door slightly ajar, something that made the hair on my neck stand up. My grandfather had always told me to trust my instincts in the woods, and he wasn't wrong. I quietly set down the bags in my truck, pulled out my phone, and checked the security feed. Sure enough, there he was, Brandon, wandering around inside my cabin like he owned it. He had a crowbar in one hand, my antique hunting knife in the other, and a look of pure arrogance on his face as he rifled through my things. The cameras even caught him pocketing some of my grandfather's keepsakes, things that had no value to anyone else, but meant the world to me. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to stay calm. Instead of charging in, I did what any responsible homeowner would do. I called the sheriff's department. Being a small town, they knew me, they knew the property, and most importantly, they knew the HOA's nonsense. Deputies were dispatched immediately, and I waited quietly by the driveway until they arrived. When they did, it was a scene I'll never forget. Brandon tried to play it cool at first, claiming he was just hanging out and that I'd given him permission, but the officers weren't buying it. They had the footage, they had the broken lock, and they had me, the property owner, standing right there. Within minutes, they had him in cuffs, squirming and whining like the spoiled child he was. That's when Karen came barreling down the street, screaming like a banshee, cell phone in hand, threatening to sue everyone in sight. She rushed at the deputies, shrieking that her baby boy was innocent and that I was framing him because I hated her family. The officers tried to calm her down, but she just kept getting louder, even grabbing one deputy's arm, which was a big mistake. They warned her once, twice, and then when she refused to back off, they threatened to arrest her too. The look on her face when she realized she wasn't in control for the first time in her life was priceless. She sputtered, screamed, and tried to pull her son free, but the deputies stood their ground. Brandon was loaded into the back of the squad car, and Karen was left standing in my driveway, red-faced and trembling with rage. Instead of backing down, though, she made a fatal mistake. She called in reinforcements. Within the hour, she had gathered half the HOA board in front of my cabin, waving clipboards and demanding that the deputies release Brandon immediately because this is private HOA business. The sheriff himself showed up at that point, shaking his head at the circus that had formed. He calmly explained in front of everyone that my cabin was outside of the HOA's authority, that Brandon was being charged with breaking and entering, theft, and property damage, and that Karen had no legal standing in any of it. The board members looked uncomfortable, realizing they'd hitched their wagon to the wrong horse, but Karen doubled down, screaming about how this was harassment and discrimination. The sheriff told her flat out that if she didn't leave my property immediately, she'd be the next one in handcuffs. I stood there silently, arms crossed, letting it all unfold. For once, I didn't have to fight my own battle. The truth was enough. And as the patrol car carrying Brandon pulled away, I knew this was only the beginning. Because if I'd learned anything about Karen in the short time I'd lived there, it was that she wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. The night after Brandon was taken away in handcuffs should have been peaceful, but instead it felt like the air was heavy with tension, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder even when you're alone. I sat on the porch, the old rocking chair creaking under me, sipping coffee and staring out at the lake, trying to process everything that had just happened. Part of me felt a strange satisfaction that justice had been served. Seeing that smug kid in cuffs was like watching the universe balance itself, but another part of me knew Karen wasn't going to let it go. She'd been embarrassed in front of her neighbors, her fellow HOA board members, and the sheriff himself. For someone like her, image was everything and humiliation was fuel for vengeance. Sure enough, the next morning, I woke up to find flyers plastered all over my mailbox, my truck windshield, and even nailed to one of the trees by the driveway. They were printed rants from Karen, claiming I was a dangerous man who was terrorizing the neighborhood, accusing me of lying to law enforcement, and even implying I was some kind of ex-con squatter who didn't belong in the community. It was laughable, really, considering the cabin had been in my family since before her subdivision even existed. But lies have a way of spreading fast, especially when whispered through the grapevine of gossip-hungry neighbors. People started giving me odd looks at the general store, conversations would stop when I walked in, and even some of the folks I thought were friendly began keeping their distance. Karen was poisoning the well, and as much as I wanted to ignore it, I knew I couldn't let it snowball. I decided the best course of action was to stay calm and keep documenting everything. I kept copies of the flyers, saved the camera footage, and even recorded a few late-night phone calls where she screamed obscenities into my voicemail. It wasn't hard to see she was trying to provoke me into making a mistake, into losing my temper so she could play the victim, but I wasn't about to hand her that victory. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't just some backwoods recluse. I worked remotely as a consultant for a legal compliance firm, and I knew my way around paperwork and liability better than most people. If she wanted a war of documentation, I was more than ready. But Karen, being Karen, couldn't settle for just gossip and smear campaigns. About a week after Brandon's arrest, I came home from running errands to find a group of HOA members standing at the end of my driveway, blocking the entrance. They had their clipboards out, Karen front and center like she was leading an army, and they were shouting about how I was violating community standards. I parked my truck on the road, got out calmly, and asked what exactly they thought they were doing on my property. That's when Karen smugly waved a stack of papers in my face, claiming the HOA had voted unanimously to impose a fine of $5,000 for unauthorized structures and non-compliant exterior appearance. I laughed so hard I nearly doubled over, because again, my cabin wasn't under HOA authority, something the sheriff had already spelled out for her in plain English. When I told her she had no jurisdiction, she doubled down, saying she had consulted a lawyer, and that they could put a lien on my property if I didn't pay. It was pure bluff, and I knew it, but her confidence was clearly designed to intimidate me. Unfortunately for her, I had my phone out recording the entire interaction, capturing every lie and threat. When I asked her to step off my property, she refused, so I called the sheriff's department again. By now, they were almost used to Karen's antics, and two deputies showed up within 20 minutes. Watching their faces as Karen tried to explain her legal authority was like watching someone try to reason with a brick wall. They had zero patience left. They told her very firmly that the HOA had no power here, that if she kept harassing me, I could pursue a restraining order, and that her trespassing could result in charges. The board members behind her shifted, uncomfortably, clearly regretting being dragged into her vendetta, and one by one they dispersed, leaving Karen red-faced and sputtering as the deputies escorted her off my driveway. I thought maybe, just maybe, that would scare her into backing off. I underestimated just how far someone like her would go when she felt her authority slipping. That very night, around midnight, my security cameras caught something that made my stomach drop. Headlights creeping down my driveway, followed by the sound of car doors slamming. It was Karen again, this time with two of her bored lackeys sneaking around with flashlights. They went straight for my shed, fiddling with the lock, like they were trying to break in. My heart pounded as I watched the feed on my phone from the safety of my bedroom, every instinct telling me to storm out there and confront them, but common sense stopped me. Instead, I hit record, called the sheriff's office, and waited. By the time the deputies arrived, Karen and her crew were already inside my shed, rummaging through my tools and supplies like burglars. The deputies caught them red-handed, and when confronted, Karen had the audacity to claim that the shed was an eyesore and that the HOA had the right to inspect it for compliance. The deputies didn't even entertain the excuse. They slapped cuffs on one of her board members who resisted, and they issued Karen a formal warning that if she was caught on my property again, she'd be arrested. I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt exhausted. It was like swatting at hornets. No matter how many you knocked down, more kept coming. The thing about entitled people like Karen is that they thrive on attention, on conflict, on dragging others into their drama, and as long as she had an audience, she wasn't going to stop. Still, I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of breaking me. I doubled down on my preparations, upgraded my security system with floodlights and alarms, installed motion detectors, and even bought a big lockbox for my grandfather's keepsakes. The cabin might have been small and humble, but it was my fortress, and I wasn't going to let some entitled neighbor tear it down. The real turning point, though, came a few days later when I received a letter in the mail, not from Karen, not from the HOA, but from Brandon himself. Or, rather, from his court-appointed lawyer. It was a formal notice informing me that they planned to argue Brandon's breaking and entering charges were a misunderstanding, that he believed the cabin was community property, and that he was simply checking on it out of concern. I nearly tore the letter in half from laughing, because it was the most desperate excuse I'd ever seen, but I also knew it meant the upcoming court case was going to drag all of this drama into the spotlight. Karen wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting reality, the law, and her own son's criminal record. And as much as she thought she was in control, the truth was the walls were closing in on her, and I was more than ready to watch them crush her. The court date arrived faster than I expected, and when I walked into that small-town courthouse, I could feel the eyes of half the community burning into me. Karen had turned the whole thing into a spectacle, spreading rumors that this was some kind of vendetta trial where her son was being wrongfully accused by a bitter outsider who hated young people. It was absurd, but she had her little entourage with her, other board members, nosy neighbors, and even a few people who clearly just came for the drama. Brandon sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit, looking less like a victim of injustice and more like a sulky teenager being forced to dress up for church. He kept glancing nervously at Karen, who sat directly behind him like a general watching her soldier. I took my place on the other side, calm and collected, because I knew the evidence was stacked in my favor. My attorney, a no-nonsense local who had dealt with plenty of HOA nonsense before, laid it out cleanly. Security footage of Brandon breaking the lock, wandering through my cabin, and pocketing my grandfather's belongings, photographs of a damaged door frame. and audio of his own voice on camera making cocky remarks about finally getting to keep the cool stuff. The prosecution barely had to do any work because the case was practically gift wrapped. But Karen, of course, couldn't keep her mouth shut. When it was the defense's turn, she tried to inject herself into the testimony, whispering loudly to Brandon's lawyer, shaking her head dramatically, and even standing up at one point to declare that her son was being framed. The judge, an older man with zero tolerance for theatrics, slammed his gavel and told her if she spoke out again, she'd be removed from the courtroom. That should have been enough to quiet her. But Karen's sense of self-importance was stronger than her common sense. When Brandon's lawyer argued that he thought the cabin was community property, the judge asked Karen to explain on what grounds she or her son believed that to be true. With the entire courtroom staring at her, she launched into a rant about how the cabin affected the property values of the neighborhood, how the HOA had plans for the area, and how my refusal to comply with her rules meant the cabin was essentially abandoned and therefore fair game. It was one of the most ridiculous things I'd ever heard, and I could see the judge's patience wearing thin. He interrupted her mid-sentence and reminded her that property law was not a matter of opinion, that the cabin was legally deeded to me, and that her son had no right to be there under any circumstances. Brandon's lawyer tried to recover, but it was too late. The damage was done. The jury didn't take long to deliberate, and when they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty on charges of breaking and entering and theft. Brandon's face went pale, and Karen exploded, standing up and shouting that the court was corrupt, that I had bribed the sheriff, and that this was all a conspiracy to destroy her family. The bailiffs escorted her out as she kicked and screamed, while Brandon sat silently, his head hanging low. The judge sentenced him to probation, community service, and mandatory counseling, sparing him jail time only because of his age and lack of prior record, but the stain on his reputation and Karen's was permanent. I thought that would finally be the end of it, that Karen would retreat in shame and lick her wounds quietly, but if anything, the public humiliation only made her more dangerous. A week later, I came home to find my mailbox smashed to pieces, tire tracks in my yard, and spray-painted insults on my fence calling me a snake and a liar. The security cameras didn't catch the culprits this time, but I didn't need footage to know who was behind it. The vandalism was a message, a desperate act of retaliation from someone who was losing her grip on power. I reported it, of course, but the deputies told me they needed evidence before they could pin it on Karen. So, once again, I waited, documented, and kept my guard up. Sure enough, Karen couldn't help herself. A few nights later, she and two of her friends were caught on camera again, this time trying to dump trash bags full of rotten food and old newspapers in my driveway. I didn't even call the sheriff right away. Instead, I waited until morning and printed off still images from the footage. Then I drove straight to the HOA's next meeting, which was open to the community, and walked in with the evidence in hand. Karen was at the podium, as usual, lecturing everyone about keeping the neighborhood clean, when I strode up, interrupted her mid-speech, and held up the photos for the whole room to see. Gasps echoed through the hall as people realized what they were looking at, their so-called leader caught red-handed in her own hypocrisy. Karen tried to snatch the papers from me, but I pulled them back and handed copies to the board members. The room erupted into chaos, neighbors shouting, board members whispering urgently to one another, and Karen screaming that the images were doctored. But the damage was done. Her credibility shattered in an instant, and the board had no choice but to call an emergency vote. Within 15 minutes, Karen was stripped of her title as HOA president, her leadership revoked by the very people she thought she controlled. Watching her face as she realized her reign was almost sweeter than seeing Brandon hauled off in cuffs. She stormed out, swearing revenge and vowing that this wasn't over, but her power was gone. I should have felt relief, and in a way I did, but I also knew someone as unhinged as Karen wouldn't just fade quietly into the background. She had lost her throne. Her son was branded a criminal, and her reputation was in tatters. People like her don't accept defeat. They plot, they scheme, and they wait for a chance to strike back harder than before. And sure enough, the very next day, I noticed something unsettling. A strange car parked near the edge of my property, its occupants sitting there for hours watching the cabin. It wasn't anyone from a neighborhood, and when I approached, the vehicle sped off before I could get a good look at the plates. My gut told me Karen was pulling strings behind the scenes, desperate to claw back control, and I realized then that the war wasn't over. It was only escalating, and if she thought she could intimidate me into leaving the cabin, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The days after Karen was dethroned as HOA president were deceptively quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that feels like the calm before a storm. And though part of me wanted to believe she had finally given up, I knew better than to trust appearances. I doubled down on security, kept my phone charged and ready to record at all times, and even started keeping a journal of every strange occurrence, because if Karen was going to come at me again, I was going to make sure the law saw every single move she made. It didn't take long before she proved me right. Late one night, I was woken up by the blaring alarm of my motion sensors, the floodlights flashing on outside the cabin, and when I pulled up the live feed on my phone, my stomach clenched. Karen wasn't alone this time. She had brought 4 people with her. Men I didn't recognize, all of them carrying bags and tools, clearly intending something more serious than dumping garbage. One of them even had what looked like a gas can, and that was the moment I realized they weren't just here to harass me. They were here to scare me into leaving or worse. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher everything I was seeing, and within minutes, I heard the distant wail of sirens. But before the deputies arrived, I decided I wasn't going to cower in the dark. I stepped out onto the porch with my flashlight and my grandfather's old shotgun, not loaded just for intimidation, and shouted across the yard that they were being recorded, that the sheriff was on the way, and that if they didn't leave, they'd all be arrested. The look on Karen's face when the floodlight illuminated her was unforgettable. Wild-eyed, hair disheveled, her perfect mask of control shattered into raw fury. She screamed at me, calling me a squatter, a thief, and every name in the book, but when the sirens grew louder, her confidence cracked. The men with her started backing away, clearly not eager to get caught in whatever scheme she had cooked up, and by the time the deputies' cruisers came barreling down my driveway, Karen was the only one still standing defiantly in the open, screaming her lungs out while the others scattered into the woods. The deputies swarmed in, weapons drawn, and ordered her to the ground. For a moment, she refused, ranting about her rights and the corruption of the sheriff's department. But when one of the deputies stepped forward with handcuffs, she finally snapped and lunged toward my porch, shrieking like she was going to claw me apart with her bare hands. She didn't get far. 2 deputies tackled her to the ground, cuffed her, and dragged her away, kicking and spitting like a rabid animal. Watching Karen finally in handcuffs after all her smug, entitled posturing was a moment of pure vindication, a scene so satisfying I wished I could frame it. The deputies thanked me for keeping calm, collected the gas can and the tools as evidence, and assured me this time the charges would stick: attempted arson, trespassing, harassment, conspiracy, the list went on. It was no longer petty HOA nonsense. It was criminal, and the law was finally treating it as such. Over the following weeks, the fallout was nothing short of spectacular. The community that once whispered and gossiped about me now turned its full attention to Karen's downfall. Stories spread of how she had bullied neighbors for years, imposed fines that weren't enforceable, and manipulated the HOA for her own gain. With her arrested and exposed, people suddenly found their voices, sharing stories and filing complaints, and the HOA itself began to unravel as members distanced themselves from her legacy of control. Brandon, meanwhile, was forced to complete his community service hours cleaning roadsides, and though I occasionally saw him sulking around town, he never once looked me in the eye again. Karen's trial was even more dramatic than her son's, because this time she couldn't twist the narrative into some kind of misunderstanding. The evidence was overwhelming. My security footage, the recovered gas can, the witness statements from the deputies, even testimony from one of the men she had dragged along who admitted she had promised them money if they helped her send a message. The judge didn't hold back, sentencing her to jail time along with fines and restitution. For someone who had spent years lording over others, dictating their every move, The image of Karen being led out of court in shackles was the ultimate reversal. I could have walked away at that point, sold the cabin, and started fresh somewhere else, but the truth was, this place wasn't just a house. It was my family's legacy, my grandfather's pride, and my sanctuary, and I wasn't about to let an entitled woman and her spoiled kid drive me out. Instead, I rebuilt what she had tried to destroy, repaired the mailbox, repainted the fence, and even hosted a small gathering for the neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak against her. To my surprise, many of them showed up, some sheepish, some apologetic, but all relieved that Karen's reign of terror was finally over. We shared stories, laughed about her absurd rules, and for the first time since moving in, I felt like I was truly part of the community. The cabin became more than just a home again. It became a symbol of standing up to bullies, of not letting entitlement crush what's right. Sometimes when I sit on the porch at dusk, rocking in that old chair and watching the lake shimmer in the fading light, I think about how close things came to spiraling out of control, how easily I could have lost everything if I had given in to anger or fear. But instead, I held my ground, trusted the truth, and let Karen's own arrogance be her undoing. In the end, her son was cuffed, she was crushed, and the HOA that once seemed untouchable was left in ruins, replaced by a community that finally learned what happens when you let one entitled person run unchecked. And as for me, I finally got my peace, the kind my grandfather always said the cabin was meant to give, peace that wasn't given by Karen or the HOA, but earned through patience, persistence, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the best revenge is simply outlasting the people who try to tear you down.